So good morning everyone and welcome to the seminar series arranged by the Faculty of Economics, Thammasat University. Today we have a great pleasure to welcome Prof.Eric Ramstetter from the Asian Growth Research Institute and Kyushu University, Japan. And he is the Associate Editor of the ASEAN Economic Journal. Right now he is a visiting scholar of our faculty. And today he will present a paper entitled Wage, Foreign Worker and Multinational Enterprise in Malaysia. So Eric, you have around 40 to 45 minutes for the presentations and then we will later do for the discussions. Okay, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I guess I should turn this on. All right, thank you very much for coming. I look very forward to your comments and suggestions immensely. This presentation is going to summarize two different approaches to answering the same two questions. Okay? The first question actually differs between the two papers because the nature of the way the econometrics works out ends up asking different questions. But the basic question is, does the presence of foreign workers affect average wages paid to a certain cohort by manufacturing plants in Malaysia? And we're looking at Malaysia in the mid-1990s. Now, Malaysia in the mid-1990s is actually, I think, very interesting from the Thai point of view. In many ways, this was the beginning of the first real boom of foreign workers coming into Malaysia. And foreign worker shares of workers in Malaysian manufacturing plants increased quite dramatically during this period. We'll see some of that in the data. Then there was a bit of a lull and it started increasing again after 2000. Malaysia is very different than most other Asian economies. Most Asian economies have relatively low shares of foreign workers. All right, the three major exceptions are Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia. All right. Other countries send out are sources of foreign workers for a number of countries, both inside and outside of the region. But in general, Asian economies rely on relatively low levels of foreign workers. The stark exceptions being in Southeast Asia, Singapore, and Malaysia, and in East Asia, Hong Kong. In recent years, you've seen dramatic growth, however, in the use of foreign workers in Korea and Taiwan, and also in Japan. The absolute ratios of foreign workers to total workers remain quite low, 2-3% in Japan, 4-5% in Korea or Taiwan, compared to Malaysia, where it's closer to 10 or 15% if you look economy-wide. And Thailand is probably, it's really hard to guess in Thailand right now because the data don't capture a lot of the immigration. But one would guess 5%, maybe 10%, somewhere in between, I think on aggregate. In some sectors, much, much higher. And so, use of foreign workers is an important policy problem, or presents important policy problems for the government in Thailand right now. And the big question, of course, is always, how do foreign workers complement or substitute local workers? If foreign workers are primarily complements to local workers, then you expect that both the foreign workers will do relatively well, and the use of foreign workers may well lead to greater efficiency among local workers and higher wages. So increased foreign worker presence could actually lead to higher wages among local workers. And indeed, the existing empirical evidence in Europe, in the United States, and the small amount that exists in Japan suggests that a negative penalty for foreign worker presence is relatively rare. That once in a while you find it, usually you find it at relatively low skill levels. That is to say, where you have large numbers of foreign workers and large numbers of local workers competing in relatively low-skilled occupation, there can be negative effects. And it becomes most obvious in those skill ranges because those workers have the fewest options, right? If you have a certain level of skill, even if you get thrown out of company A and have to move to an entire new industry in company C, if you have relevant training or relevant experience, you can adapt, right? But if you're unskilled or your basic skills are at a relatively low level, that process is much more difficult, and that can lead to head-to-head competition. And because presumably foreign workers are coming in predominantly, especially at lower skill levels, at lower wages, the net effect on the labor market might be negative. Now, in the first paper, I look at the effect of foreign workers in a very detailed way. In particular, I run separate wage equations for 5 different occupations and 2 sexes. That's 10 equations per worker per industry, right? And I do it by industry for 7 different industry groups because I'm not convinced that labor markets are entirely competitive, all right? I am convinced that there are frictions to moving among industries, moving between sexual occupations. Females in Malaysia, like females in most countries, tend to get paid less than males, and one has to be very cognizant of that. And therefore, you would expect not only that the male-female wage differential be different, but that the entire wage equation may be different. The slope coefficients for all other relevant variables may differ between males and females as well. And when you run separate equations by males and females for 5 occupations, there is one important advantage. You are de facto, by default, controlling for labor quality probably pretty well. If you have 5 occupations and 2 sexes, that's a wide variation of labor quality in different categories with different expected wages, right? You expect females to earn less than males. You expect highly paid occupations like managers to earn more than technicians, to earn more than the middle, I can't remember, we'll see what they're called in a minute here, the middle level of workers. And then you have the relatively unskilled at the bottom, and they earn the least. And the average patterns of wages that you see in the data reflect our expectations, and the data seem to be relatively reasonable. These data are unique. I've never seen them for any other country in any other period where I could break up factory level data and have data on wages for occupation, and it's actually up to 14 occupations. I wanted to use 14 occupations I could, but I didn't think that was a reasonable approach either. So I distilled it into 5 different occupations and 2 sexes. The second paper looks at the same question, well, the first question, but looks at the effect on aggregate plant wages using wage and occupation as control variables on the right-hand side. This still controls for occupation effects and controls for sex effects, but it does so much less rigorously than the first approach, all right? And this is because you're forcing slope coefficients to be equal across all cohorts of workers, and that the differential must be the same, the male-female differential must be the same across all cohorts of workers. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, wage equations like the ones I'm going to estimate are originally, they come out of labor economics literature used to estimate the wages of individuals, okay? And the 2 key variables on the right-hand side are thought to be measures of human capital. usually investment in education and maybe experience. And then also experience, where experience usually enters with a square. That is, you expect the linear portion of the experience or the age variable to have a positive coefficient and the squared term to have a negative coefficient. Why? Because after you reach an age about 5 years younger than me, your earning potential starts to go down, right? You earn more as you get older up to a point. After you wear out and get old, you start earning less, all right? And that's what happens. And the data usually fit that fairly well. I want to emphasize, what I'm doing here is very different. What I'm doing here is estimating average plant wages for a certain class or a certain cohort of workers. All right? So this is, the left-hand variable is not the wage of an individual in a certain group, but the wage, the average wage the plant pays to that group of workers. All right? And because of that, I don't have an experience variable on the right-hand side. This is an obvious and potentially important cause of omitted variable bias, in the sense that we are ignoring an important element of worker experience. On the other hand, because we have occupation and sex in such detail, one can argue that that omission is not as serious. And indeed, in other studies of Vietnam, they have these fancy new omitted variable bias tests nowadays. I don't know if I believe them, because the more I look at them, they seem like comparing R-squares from two totally different regressions. And you know that's not smart econometrics, right? You don't just pick the equation with the higher R-squared. You need to think about why you have an equation defined the way you do. The second question I ask in this paper has to do with the wage differential between multinational companies and non-multinational companies. We know from previous studies of Indonesia in particular, but also Malaysia in more recent years, 2000 to 2004, and other, Vietnam in particular, also China, that MNEs do tend to pay relatively high wages, even after accounting for worker quality, capital intensity, plant size, other plant and worker characteristics that we think affect wages. This difference also often remains significant. It's very interesting that wage differentials remain significant because similar or corresponding differences in productivity are almost always insignificant, especially in Malaysia and Thailand. Right? Vietnam and Indonesia, there's a little more significant differences in terms of productivity as well, but even there, productivity differentials are less common, less consistent, and less pervasive than our wage differential. You might want to ask why. Because without differentials in productivity, how do we get differentials in wages? Part of the answer is the measure of productivity you're using, whether you're measuring labor productivity or TFP or something else. And the other problem is, frankly, I think our wage equations that we're using in these models, or in this paper, are much better than our production functions. Production functions are subject to a lot of error. And I don't trust productivity estimates from production functions. Judith Tittman and I have written a number of papers on this, and she knows how I feel about that. So I'm very skeptical of the production function results because, especially for Malaysia and Thailand, casual observations suggest to you that, yeah, the MNE plants around here are probably more productive than local plants on average. But if you get down to the microdata, whether it's from the industrial census in Thailand, whether it's from the industrial surveys in Malaysia that we've used, especially when you break it out by industry, those differentials disappear. And sometimes they become negative. So the question is why? So first question is, how do foreign workers affect worker wages? Second is, how does ownership of the plant, whether it's M&E or not, and answers to both are going to be a little surprising. All right. Because I have two questions, I have two distinct types of literature to go through. All right, the first looks at foreign workers and wages and previous plant level estimates of total wages, and this is not available at occupation from Tom and you. They're using the data from 2000 to 2006, very similar to the data I used for 2000-2004 in a previous paper on Malaysian wages, where I looked at the M&E local wage differential. But I didn't have data on foreign workers. All right. The unique thing about the data for 94 to 96 that I'm using here is that I have both those data in great detail, even more detail than Tom and you did for later years after 2000. The coefficient on the total foreign worker share was negative and highly significant, but when you disaggregated foreign workers, the coefficient on the foreign share was only significant for one occupation, and that was plant and machine operators and assemblers employed through contracts. This is the only one that turned out to be negative and significant. So it makes a big difference what class of workers you're looking at. And we'll look at that in some more detail. Another set of interesting results come from an industry-level study by Chandra Korala and Evelyn Devatson on Malaysia. And they say that if you're running industry-level regressions, and they do it both for the 90s and the 2000s, they say that foreign worker shares do have, at the industry level, a significant negative effect, but it's very small. Right? Like a 1% in the increase in the share of foreign workers leads to something like a 0.001% decline in wages. It's a very small. Probably the best estimates come from World Bank 2013. This is a very detailed study of foreign workers in Malaysia that became available on the web, but the World Bank has since disavowed knowledge of it. I think they don't want to claim it. But it's still out there if you want to get it. And they found some small negative effects on low-skilled workers. But they conclude that changes in employment caused by changes in integration to a specific region and industry do not lead to changes in wages of Malaysian workers in general. In other words, the plus-negative effect was a wash overall. And so overall you see no negative effects, but you find some small negative effects on low skilled workers. And this is both the picture you get from Tom and you in 2014 and World Bank in 2003. The picture you're going to get out of my results is going to be a bit messier, unfortunately. The big, the major study of wage differentials in Malaysia is this study of 2000-2014. I did published in Asian Development Review. Here we find that both in the aggregate, that is when all manufacturing plants are combined together and industry effects are taken care of using intercept dummies. That is to say we have the same, we're assuming the same M&E local wage differential in all industries and the same slope coefficients for all other slopes in the equation in all industries. It's very positive and highly significant at the 1% level or better in all 6 alternative estimates. Right? I have different samples, different techniques to test the robustness, and everything comes out highly significant. Moreover, I break it up into 17 more homogeneous industries. Of those industries, they're positive and significant in 6 of the 17, and in most estimates for another 5. So again, even at the industry level, fairly strong evidence that in many industries, M&Es are willing to pay higher wages to Malaysian workers on average than our local plants, even after accounting for, in this case, we have good measures of worker education on the right-hand side, in addition to occupation. So we do have pretty good control for the worker effects or worker skills in that. In at the Corala and Thammasat, again, when they do the industry level results, you get somewhat different results, and that is to say, it does come out negative, but it's only significant with one of their 8 estimates. And again, the effect is very weak. The difference in the factory level results and the industry level results in these kinds of regressions are often stark. Most of the time, we tend to believe the factory or the firm level results more because we have more accurate measurement of what's going on. Okay, then one last point. Okay, let's just look at the data. Actually, probably best to go to the tables now. All right, these data come from industrial surveys of Malaysian plants in the mid-1990s. These are stratified samples, okay? They cover almost all the large plants. When you get into the smaller plants, ones with fewer than 50 or fewer than 20 employees, probably they're using stratified, increasingly small sample stratified samples. Comparing the data for the census years were 93, 2000, 2004, 2005, and 2010. If you compare, especially through 2005, the sample coverage is pretty good. After 2005, the sample coverage really seems to change in Malaysia, but I haven't seen any factory level data after 2004. Most recent data I have are through 2000. We're looking at, first of all, mean wages in all plants. In the left end, you see quite a bit of variation across industries. General and transport industry generally paying high wages. Textiles, apparel, and footwear generally paying low wages. You see that in the middle 3 columns you have multinationals, and in the right 3 columns you have local plants. And in almost all categories, the M&Es are paying higher wages. The major exception is this electronics category. And this is because M&Es dominate electronics. 95% of it's M&Es, right? If you look down at the bottom, you see paid workers and M&Es in the electronics related. Oh, it's only 50,000. 10%? That surprises me. I thought this would be much higher. But I guess it's because I'm using a very broad definition. If you looked at the big companies, the Intels and so on, the Japanese makers, they're all there. Those numbers possible. All right. But at any rate, you see the most important thing is the pattern of the wages. These are the foreign shares. And as I said, there was dramatic increase in the foreign share during this period, and actually during the early 1990s. If you were to take this series back to 1990, this ratio is probably under 5%. So you see a tremendous growth in foreign workers in the early 90s in Malaysia. This, remember, was the end of the Asian boom. The 1986, 1996 economic boom that started with a lot of people give credit to the yen depreciation, but there were a number of international factors. Not only that, but you had severe recession in Singapore and in Malaysia in 1985. So you had a rebound from the recession coming along with the effects of a yen depreciation or a yen appreciation. And a huge influx of Japanese and Korean and Taiwanese money that came in after that. Also Hong Kong and Singapore. You see that these are all occupations. If you look at the shares by occupation, by far the largest in unskilled and part-time. There are also quite a few general and semi-skilled workers. And these last two groups are much, much larger, right? If you go back to the table, oops. This is the total number of foreign workers. You see, even in this short period, the number doubled. This doesn't have the occupation rate. I was looking for occupation. But by far, the largest number of workers are, of course, in these three groups at the bottom. Managers is the smallest group by far, and technical and supervisory is not huge. But they are big enough to make reasonable samples so we can go and look at what determines wages. The left-hand side of this variable is the log of the real wage. The two major plant level characteristics we try to control for are capital intensity, it's the log of capital intensity, and this is the log of output for a size control. You expect both more capital intensive and larger plants to pay higher wages. You expect positive coefficients there. Then what we do here is, these are the shares of local workers by occupation, all right? The fifth occupation is manager. Right? Is that right? Fifth occupation is unskilled. That's right. So the control group, this is essentially trying to pick up the level of the skill level of the local workforce compared to the number of unskilled workers. Right? So you expect all of these coefficients to be positive. Right? Because you expect SL5 to have by far the lowest wages. You've taken the lowest wage group as a...
How do you measure the skill? Number of years of work?
No, this is by occupation.
Yeah, by occupation.
By occupation. And they're reported by the firm plant. How many production workers do you have? How many managers do you have? How many technicians do you have? And these are only the local. See, SL1 is the share of local managers in all workers. SL2 is showing local technical and supervisory. And we leave out SL5, which is the unskilled. So these coefficients should all be positive. They reflect the skill composition of local workers in the plant. And that, of course, affects wages, right? The other thing we can do in this data set that's quite unique and quite interesting is I have information on ethnic Chinese and ethnic Indians. So I put in SLC, the share of ethnic Chinese, and SLI with a share of ethnic Indians. In Malaysia, you of course expect the coefficient on SLC to be positive, because in Malaysia, Chinese workers generally make more than Malay workers. a little more question mark about the Indian one, but this actually turns out to be positive when it's significant. Not always significant. And then we also included the, I dropped it from this specification. This variable is no longer here. We had other non-Malay workers, but that turned out to be insignificant. So we combined the Malay and other ethnic minorities as the control group. We then have the share of females among local workers. This is the share of all foreign workers, which is this one. The next variable here is the share of female foreign workers. Because again, we're interested in, is there a difference depending on whether the foreign workers are female or not? And then finally, a dummy variable as to whether this is a multinational or not. Now this is the first attempt that we use in the second paper. Oh, wait a minute, no, this is the first paper. Excuse me. Share of local workers. Then the second equation, actually these are all from I must apologize. These two equations come from the second paper, okay, where we're combining all of them together. And this is the second equation, and what the difference between this equation and the first equation is just the disaggregation of foreign workers into different worker classes. And here, these are managers, technicians, the clerical and skilled workers, then general and semi-skilled, and finally unskilled. Okay, these are the results . These are coefficients on local worker shares, okay? First of all, this is the goodness of fit. These are panels, very short panels, across 3 years, usually only 2, because I'm lagging important variables or testing what it means to drop 1994. I get consistent results all across. Share of local managers is always positive and significant. The share of local technicians and supervisors, again, always positive and significant. The share of local clerical and skilled workers, again, significant. And then when you get to the general and semi-skilled, sometimes, especially in the electronics-related machinery category, it's not significant. Sometimes on the left-hand side, actually at all the industry levels regressions, that becomes insignificant. I tend to believe this left-hand column the most. This is because all right-hand variables are lagged 1 period. This removes some of the concern about simultaneity, not all of it, of course. But also because, actually the lagging is the most important one. Now the contemporaneous specifications are included because I'm very worried about sensitivity to dropping observations. All right, and if I have 94 to 96, I have a much bigger sample to work with than if I have just 95, 96. So I'm looking at the consequences of changing the estimation technique, all right, from using lag to contemporaneous variables, and these are all random effects estimates. Again, especially when it comes to the MNE local wage differential, I need to use random effects. I can't use fixed effects because ownership doesn't change in most plants. And if ownership doesn't change and I use a fixed effects estimator, all I do is pick up the change of ownership change. All I do is pick up the effect of ownership changes, not absolute levels of ownership. Okay. Then here are the SLC, the share on Chinese workers. You see these are almost all positive and significant. And the share on Indian workers is far less consistent. It's really only positive and significant in the total sample and electronics related machinery for the lag specification. All right, and then finally what we're really interested in here are the, this is the share of local females. Again, this shows you that the male-female wage differential is negative and significant. Not very large, 0.5, 0.4%, right? But very significant. Tells you the distribution's really tight. Then, looking at the coefficients on foreign workers and the MNEW, in the lag specification, all foreign workers, if you use all foreign workers, you get a negative effect in all industries, a negative effect in electronic machinery, and a negative effect in food and beverages, but insignificant everywhere else. And if you look at the share of foreign workers, and I want to emphasize the difference here. I mean, this result for all sample industries is quite clearly being driven by these two large industries. It doesn't apply to these industries. Food and beverages is a large industry. Electronics related machinery is a large industry in Malaysia at this time. And they can easily drive the results for the whole sample. But if you allow the slope coefficients to differ in these other industries, and we have sufficient observations, well over 100 observations in all of these samples, usually much more. Then the share on female workers, almost never significant. Where it is significant, actually it's positive in metals and non-metallic. Now the one thing that surprised me most about this was this result. Okay? You do see a positive wage differential, about 6.4% overall, but it's all over the map at the industry level, and there are only 4 industries where it's positive and significant in this specification. What's more, when you break this specification up, and that is you start looking at the shares by type of worker, similar to the way that Tom and you looked at, you find that first of all, for managers, when it's significant, it's usually positive. This makes sense. In the mid-1990s, if you're a manufacturing plant in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and you're going to hire a foreign manager, that manager is probably going to be a high-paid guy, right? Not a low-paid guy. So that leads to higher average plant wages for your managers, right? The share of foreign technicians doesn't have any effect in any industry except electronics-related machines. And there it's a very small negative effect. If you look at the share of clerical and skilled workers, again, in the lag specification, absolutely nothing is significant. that's the one you're going to trust the most. If you look at general and semi-skilled workers, some weak effects, some weak negative effects. Certainly in electronics you see it. You see some evidence in metals, some evidence in food and beverages, but again, it's relatively weak. Only significant at the 10% level. And again, these are relatively large samples. So you're probably better off using the 5% cutoff here than the 10%. And then finally, for unskilled and part-time, using the lag specification, nothing significant. Here you get contracting results if you use the contemporary. And this is the class of workers you're most worried about, right? From a policy point of view. If you're a Malaysian policymaker in the mid-1990s, you're not particularly concerned if your manufacturing plants want to be hiring high-paid foreign workers, managers, and technicians, and so on. You can rest pretty much assured that if a firm thinks it's worth it to pay those guys that money, that's probably good for the firm, good for the workers in that firm. What you're most concerned about is the potential that your local unskilled workers can get displaced. Why are you concerned about that? It's the Trump phenomenon in a different clothing, right? Basically, when foreign workers come in and hurt your low-class workers, nationalistic reactions become strong. Whether it's the US or Malaysia or the UK or Australia or Canada. Now, we all differ in the vehemence of our reaction, right? And some leaders are smarter than others. But this is the class of people you would worry about most as a policymaker. Why would you worry about them most? Because they were least able to adapt to the situation and move on. And most likely to cause economic and or political disruption. And when you disaggregate this, again, the share of female foreign workers doesn't matter much, except in the metals category. And the foreign local differentials only remain significant in chemicals. And this is very similar to the result that I got using the much more disaggregate approach, where I couldn't present all the results in just these tables. If you want to let's just run through the conclusions briefly. All right, I'm right about it. In a previous paper, I estimated similar wage equations using separate estimates for 5 occupation groups of both sexes in large heterogeneous samples of plants in many industries and more homogeneous samples of plants in 7 industries combined. Results indicated that use of foreign workers generally had significant effects on plant wages for most occupation, sex, and industry combinations, and that M&E local differentials were almost always insignificant in 3 industries and consistently significant in only 1, that's chemicals. This is the first paper. I didn't show you the results of here. I'm sorry I got confused in my presentation. I thought I had those results. The reason I don't have these results is because they're very lengthy. They're very, very difficult to summarize. Right? We just saw it for one class of workers. It's 5 times that amount of information that you'd have to plow through to see all this. But the results are very similar. Okay? And they tell you basically that foreign worker presence had very little effect on wages in Malaysia. Now, another big advantage of this approach is that I can consider, or I considered, 3 types of wage effects. When I'm considering wages of male managers, for example, the first thing I think about is the presence of foreign male managers. Okay? The second thing I think about is the presence of foreign female managers. And then third thing I thought about was the presence of all other foreign workers. Okay. And again, when you broke it up that way, it was the direct effect that was most important, but it wasn't important very often. The fundamental results were very similar here. That is to say, the statistical relationship between foreign worker presence and the average wage paid to a given cohort of workers in Malaysian plants, however you cut it out, was relatively weak during this period. I interpret this as being consistent with results from many other countries. That, first of all, foreign workers have both positive and negative effects that tend to wash out sometimes. And second of all, the other forces driving wage determination are just much more important. Although separate estimation by sex and occupation has a strong advantage of accounting for worker characteristics relatively well, it has the disadvantages of complexity and being difficult to compare to more common approaches, which use sex and occupation as independent variables. Again, when we have sex and occupation on the right-hand side, we're much more in the mainstream of this literature. It's not as good, in my opinion. It's not as accurate, but it's much more mainstream. The primary purpose of this paper was thus to see if using sex and occupation as independent variables generates results that differ from estimating wage equations for each sex occupation cohort separately. And the results suggest that the effects of foreign worker shares differ substantially among foreign occupations and among industries. Plants that have large foreign manager shares tend to pay relatively high wages in most industries. But the effects of other occupations are usually insignificant or inconsistent. Results that assume all foreign workers impart the same effects thus appear misleading, as do results assuming identical slope coefficients among industries. This is an important point. You have to dig down to the industry level to get a more realistic picture. Similar to previous estimates, M&E local wage differentials were consistently positive and significant in relatively few industries, only chemicals and food. This contrasts with previous results, which could not account for the effects of foreign worker share. Combined with results from the previous study, the results suggest that foreign worker shares were usually weakly correlated with plant wages, and that significant M&E local differentials were scarce during this period in Malaysian manufacturing. Now, I've emphasized throughout this presentation how fixed effects are not useful for answering the question I wanted to answer. But fixed effects are useful to estimate the effects of changes in foreign shares. Now this would be another interesting topic. But the sample of firms you'd be talking about is much smaller. And one would have to think about how to go about estimating. And the other thing one could think about would be to use other techniques that are less vulnerable to simultaneity. And I'm thinking particularly about propensity score matching. That might be one alternative. And especially if you get into the takeover discussion, where ownership is changing because samples get relatively small. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So I will open for the floor for the questions. So if you have the question, please. So,
Can I ask? I have several questions I would like to ask you. Now, in your study, it's seen that the Malaysian government policy with respect to labor market is not taking into consideration at all. Does the government policy affect, the structure of wage and so on in Malaysia? Here's the first one. Secondly, when you say foreign workers, you classify by gender for male and female. But how about the origins of the foreign workers? Do they matter? The structure of the wage payment. Thirdly, after AEC became effective, of course, the policy of free movement of 7 or 8 types of workers among AEC members, do you think that will affect the structure of wage in Malaysia? You see, let me clarify the government policy. Because a few years back, the Malaysian government has adopted the policy given priority to Malaysian people in education, in employment, and so on. I wonder that still have some effect, under your study field. Thank you.
All right. So, first of all, yes, Malaysian policy makes a huge difference. The vast majority, by the 1990s, the vast majority of foreign workers coming into Malaysian manufacturing came in, I guess it's probably the vast majority of manufacturing, came in through official channels. And the Malaysian government's way of, and this is in a separate descriptive paper I wrote, but the Malaysian government's way of controlling immigration is to sign contracts with specific supplier nations and allow foreign workers to come in under those contracts through private brokers. For the most part, it's limited to 13 or 15 nations. So yes, the policy has a huge effect. The number of workers they let in obviously will affect the extent to which, if foreign workers are earning relatively low wages, they'll put downward pressure on Malaysian wages. And I think the idea has always been to let in enough foreign workers that you avoid labor shortage in the manufacturing plants and in other industries. But also to avoid letting in too many to the point that you push wages way down. Now, there are two important exceptions to this policy that the Malaysian government, especially in the mid-1990s, did not control very well. The first was the border with Indonesia. All right, lots of workers go back and forth into Sabah and Sarawak from Kalimantan, and they do this sometimes on a daily basis. They do this on a weekly basis. Most of these workers are not registered or accounted for in any data. Now, if they're in the manufacturing plant data, they're in here, but there are very few manufacturing plants in Sabah, Sarawak, so that doesn't really affect these analyses. The other part of the policy issue with respect to immigrants in Malaysia is the existence of a very large old Filipino community in eastern Sabah that migrated in the 60s and 70s originally, and they're given one-year passes. They're not officially allowed to stay, but they're not kicked out. And there are about 100,000 of those workers. And those workers, they have freedom of movement. So sometimes they go work in Peninsular Malaysia and so on. So yes, these policies make a big difference. The question asked here was, given the decision to let the foreign workers in, what was the effect on wages? And the effect that we saw here was not much. We didn't see much.
It will be quite different if workers are allowed to move to Malaysia freely. It will respond to market incentive better.
That's a good question. The question is how. Obviously the Malaysian government controls the quota for the official migration, right? The question is how binding is that? And I don't think we have a good handle on that. My inclination is that it's not very binding. That most of the workers that want to get to Malaysia end up getting there one way or the other. All right, and increasingly they come from Bangladesh or Nepal or India, other subcontinent areas. There are a large number of workers from China, obviously a large number of workers from Indonesia. The Indonesians in particular present a small problem for the Malaysian security forces in the sense that the Indonesians blend in really well and they're very difficult to find. They speak the same language, they have more or less the same customs and religion and so on.
How about foreign workers from non-Asian region?
Not many.
Not many.
They keep it, and again, this is where I think the Malaysian immigration policy is quite different than the Singaporean policy, for example. Singaporean policy is quite open. You get many workers from all over the world. In Malaysia, it's very much national quotas, negotiated in bilateral deals with each of the source countries every year. And so that's where the big sources of workers come. And Indonesia is obviously the largest, but many other countries play a large role.
But Eric, I'm not quite sure that. I think as you mentioned, if the policy is applied for the overall industry or overall plant, it will not affect your result anyway, because this is your plans analysis, right, and your firm analysis. So because it will be wiped out.
Well, if the policy.
But I'm not sure that the policy is applied differently.
Well, if the policy was binding, all right, and they relaxed the policy, then there would be an effect observed. Okay, there might be more of an effect observed. My gut tells me that the policy wasn't very binding. That let's say manufacturing plants in Malaysia that wanted to hire foreign workers generally were able to hire as many as they wanted to at the going wages. And that foreign workers that wanted to work in Malaysia were generally able to find a way there. That supply and demand did work itself out in a way that...
But the operation of multinational enterprises requires certain type of workers.
Sure. No.
It will be quite different from local enterprises.
Well, that's why you expect MNEs maybe paying higher. Okay, and you find clear evidence in 2000, 2001.
How about top management? Are they from Asia or non-Asian for the MNE? I suspect that when they negotiate with Malaysian government, they'll bring in their own management staff.
Oh, yeah. They do. But a lot of, it's very interesting, but especially beginning in the mid-90s, a lot of the managers in affiliates of Japanese multinationals or American multinationals were actually Asians that were brought up in the firm, and they would be from Japan or somewhere else in the MNE system. Quite a few Asians, especially in Malaysia.
Yeah, I think this happened even though the local people are capable enough to do the same job, but they would prefer to have their own top management staff.
94, 95, 96 Malaysia would be a tough call. All right, and again, it was very similar in Thailand at that time. This was a time of severe labor shortage. Wages were going up very quickly in 94, 95, 96 in almost all of Southeast Asia, right? And in particular, I remember doing a lot of company interviews during that time. And I would walk around both in Thailand and in Malaysia. And in particular in Thailand and Malaysia, get complaints about inabilities to hire engineering staff, inabilities to hire technical staff, even inabilities to get managerial staff. Probably more severe in Thailand, but also very severe in Malaysia. And again, if you go back and look at enrollment rates, one of the things that really distinguishes Southeast Asia from Northeast Asia, where I live, is that enrollment rates at relatively high per capita GDP levels were still relatively low, especially in Malaysia and Thailand in the 90s. That's changed since, but at that time there was a very severe constraint, especially for high school graduates and college graduates. The last question you asked about the AEC is a little bit beyond this, because this is more of a historical exercise.
But do you think that will affect?
AEC has the potential to have a huge effect, yes. And my questions about the AEC are actually more on the other side. How effective is it really going to be? Will you be able to negotiate more or less open borders for certain classes of workers? I don't think that's a settled question yet. I think there's a lot in the AEC agreement that is still extremely vague, not very transparent.
There are many conditions.
Yeah, and it's not at all clear. Now, on the other hand, I think especially when it comes to merchandise trade, that in the last decade or so, ASEAN has made tremendous progress liberalizing trade in various commodities. And if that kind of progress can be translated to other fields through AEC, and I think that's the hope, then one can imagine a much more integrated labor market in a few years. But, again, realistically, I don't see Thailand and Malaysia, for example, integrating really closely with the CMLV countries. I don't see those labor markets getting integrated for another 50 years, maybe. It's just not practical.
Please.
Thanks, Eric, for a very interesting presentation. I couldn't give a lot of results there that I couldn't always follow, but I think the value of the presentation and so on. Yeah, just a couple of questions. First of all, and I know you sort of talked a bit about the literature in the beginning. So you've got these results, if I can understand correctly, that are saying that foreign workers are not having a negative impact on wage levels for domestic workers. I think that's the general conclusion there. Now, is that similar to other studies, or is it different from other studies? Are you have something that's unusual here in terms of results, or is it similar to what a lot of the other studies are saying?
My take on it is it's rather similar to the results for other countries in particular.
Okay.
Previous results for Malaysia, the results are similar to the World Bank disaggregated study at the worker level. They're a little different than the industry level results, but nobody got really strong negative results in any of the studies. So whether it's significant or not is different. The size of the effect is very small in any case, even if it is significant.
Okay. The other thing that there's sort of two things that strike me, and I think they go. The first one is a bit from my colleague, is that if it's a regulated inflow of workers, you would think that there wouldn't be an impact, because what the government's trying to do is saying, look, we've got a labor shortage, we need workers, okay, let's bring the workers in. So if you're doing that, you're not displacing workers or oversupplying the labor market for those types of things. So that would go in there. But you kind of said, I think what you said in your comments, Dan, is that the government wasn't necessarily able to control it, that it came and it went anyways, which it sort of goes, I guess in one sense, you could say that's supportive of your results, because it means that the labor market obviously did what it needed to do. Therefore, if there were shortages, it pulled people into that labor market. And again, that shouldn't have too much of an impact on wage. So that one, I don't know, is that the same thing? The final thing, I think is would we actually think of two different types of countries? And here we go a little more globally, and we bring in that Trump factor and so on. Would you have cases in which countries with labor shortages they bring in foreign workers because they're filling that labor shortage. That's on the one side. In a sense, it's a pull effect, right? The other situation may be kind of a push effect, that people exit their country and they go to another country because the conditions in their own country are poor and they want to get the advantage of the conditions in the other. So these are Mexican workers going to the United States because they were seeking a better life there. And so then you have a bit of a push effect. So you've got a lot of people coming over, and that may be creating the competition and driving the wages down. Can we see it like that?
Ooh. Okay. Let's back up just a little bit. I think the extent to which the Malaysians have been able to actually control their inward migration of foreign workers is a very good question. Very clearly on the border with Indonesia, they don't do a very good job, and they don't really care. There are large numbers of Indonesian workers that are absolutely crucial to the forestry and agricultural industries in Sabah and Sarawak. Number of Filipinos still working there too, and actually new Filipinos coming across, although that's a bit of an issue because of the security problems in southern Malaysia and in the southern Philippines. To the extent that those peoples leaked into peninsular Malaysia, and some of them do, and leak back and forth quite easily, no, they don't have control. But that's at the margin. I would think that the majority, I mean, the estimates I saw, and it's really hard to tell, but in the mid-2000s, there were like 2-3 million official migrants and another million or so that they haven't been able to count. A good 30 to 50% were unaccounted for by the official data, or at least that was the estimates that some economists were putting out there. I don't have a good handle on what that figure would actually be. I do know that the official figure is way too low. Is it a factor of 10%? Is it a factor of 20%? Is it a factor of 30%? How much does it go up and down over time? For example, if you were to measure that discrepancy after the dot-com crisis in 2001, which was quite severe in Malaysia, would that be very different than it would be in other years? One would think it would be, but one doesn't know. And unfortunately, I don't have a way of checking. So it's very difficult to say that in Malaysia, how well those labor markets are functioning. I think the other thing that is, the one thing I'm trying to get my head around doing this work on wages, both in Vietnam and Malaysia, is this regional and industry specific factor that you have to account for. Both Malaysia and Vietnam are wide, dispersed economies, and whether if you work in, say, one of the northeastern provinces next to the Thai border, it's very different than if you work down in Johor, or whether you work in KL, or whether you work on the eastern seaboard. And there are rigidities in the labor market that means the wages are never going to equalize across those destinations and those industries. And you better look at those as separate labor markets. That's a non-standard way of looking at labor markets, especially in a country like Malaysia, where literally, for most intents and purposes, minimum wages are illegal, and labor markets are extremely free by most world standards. All right? But even there, I think there are rigidities that one has to account for, leads to imperfections in markets, and that we don't understand the implications of those imperfections well enough to really come up with clear predictions about what foreign worker presence should do. And this more general question, I think, is really important there too. I don't think you can sort out the push and the pull factors. You're observing equilibrium. It's very much like identification of a supply and demand equation system. What you're observing are the equilibria as the supply and demand curves shift over time. And unless you're willing to make a fairly strong assumption that one of those curves is vertical or horizontal, you're not going to identify what you're estimating in terms of supply and demand curves. You're picking out the equilibrium. And as an econometrician, I have to pretend that that's somehow meaningful. It may not be theoretically, right? But empirically, it has to be interesting because that's what we deal with. That's what the policymakers deal with. And that's the information they have to inform their policies. So we have to find out some way to use that information to inform their policies. Now, my gut tells me that the Malaysians, I mean, this idea of bilateral, binational contracts, a series of binational contracts to control immigration sounds a bit convoluted to me. But it also appears that the system's not broken. It appears that the system served the Malaysians fairly well. That most workers in Malaysia have experienced relatively good increases in wages over time. That even during the slow growth in the post-crisis period, that Malaysia continues to make progress, that the quality of living continues to increase quite a bit, that by any reasonable measure, when Malaysia reaches 2020 next year, I used to live in Singapore in the early 1990s when they started advertising Malaysia is going to become a developed economy in 2020. I think you're going to have to say they made it. I mean, any reasonable, they have per capita GDP over $10,000 now, $12,000, $13,000 now. They're approaching New Zealand levels, not quite yet. But you'd have to put them as closer to the group of advanced economies than to the group of developing economies nowadays. And I think part of the thing that has worked really well for them is their ability to integrate and use foreign workers. I think this has been a plus for them. I don't think many other societies can integrate that level of foreign workers successfully. Yeah.
The other point I wanted to, sorry, just one final fact. The other point I wanted to make is, you talk about, whether these bilateral agreements are really controlling the labor market or whether there's leakage in and so on. They use that kind of thing with, Korea uses that system, right? It's similar with these bilateral agreements. And I know in Korea it's very specific. The companies apply for workers and then they tell the government, and the government goes out and accepts workers in. And I wonder, because you're dealing with manufacturing plants here, that maybe the manufacturing flow of workers, foreign workers, is controlled under those agreements, but that we get a lot of leakage. We get a lot of leakage on things like construction workers and domestic workers. Like those two categories of workers where we get a lot of overseas workers.
I think you'd also get a fair amount of leakage on low-skilled factory workers, especially flowing through Sabah from Indonesia. All right, because there are strong incentives and travel is not expensive, and people, it's very easy for Indonesians to move through Malaysia relatively unnoticed. I think that happens quite a bit. The question is how much?
I'm not an economist, so I speak a different language.
Okay.
But I hope you'll bear with me.
Okay.
You said that in the mid-90s in Malaysia, maybe in Thailand, there was a shortage of some skilled labor, technicians, managers, chemical workers, people with a certain level of skill, who were necessary for the manufacturing industries that were taking off at that time. Now, the question is this: the people who started those industries, the businessmen, capitalists, whatever, why didn't they know when they began, when they had the idea of the industry, why weren't they aware that there was going to be a shortage of skilled labor for that industry? When they started?
I think a lot of them actually were. I think a lot of those companies were actually started up certainly after the late 80s, a lot of them in the early 90s. And by then it was fairly obvious at least in Thailand, and also to a good deal, a good extent in Malaysia. And it was always known that these economies, and ADB and other agencies were complaining about this, that the amount of spending on, especially junior high education at that time, I remember junior high education being emphasized a lot by the bank and the ADB and other international agencies. And the Thais and the Malaysians kind of shrugging that off. All right, and I remember also in Thailand at the time, there were some very famous economists, both here at Thammasat and other places, who did a lot of work on the role that their perception that on-the-job training filled that gap to a large degree, especially in Thailand. That a lot of companies in Thailand were able to successfully substitute for junior high education on the job. Now, whether that's absolutely true or not, I don't know. I think the evidence on that's fairly weak. And certainly, the one thing that did change after the crisis and so on is that Thailand, Malaysia, and other countries started pumping a lot more money into junior high education. Enrollment rates went up, and all these indicators improved. But I hear there's still a problem. Right? And this goes to public policy. You know, education. I don't know, maybe this is heresy in America now, but education is, in my opinion, an area of, or a perfect example of where public policy needs to play a huge role. All right? Whether you rely on private schools to supply some of the educational resources you need or not, I don't care. But the government has to have some handle on the overall supply and some way of regulating it. Because if you leave junior high education or high school education to the free market, it's going to get undersupplied, almost by definition. And even university education likely to be undersupplied. And I think most governments have come to that conclusion across time. There's a very strong reaction against that where I'm from now. But I think it's really important to emphasize that this is where public policy really needs to play a role, and it still remains, in my opinion, one of the biggest bottlenecks faced in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Actually, to a lesser extent in Vietnam. The Vietnamese have done a lot better at a much lower level of per capita GDP in investing in their educational infrastructure than Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia has.
Sorry, I have two questions. Okay. So you talk about the nationality that have the impact on your wage equations, right? And you say the Chinese have the positive impact and Indian have the positive impact. I'm not quite sure that because you estimate only 1994 to 1996, right? So after this time, the Malaysian government, right, try to improve this kind of unequality between Chinese, Malay, India. Do you think your result will change or not? If you have the data easily to duplicate the same result as you have. The first question. Second one is right now we have more on the outward foreign direct investment. You think because you look at only the incoming for the MNE, if we include the outward FDI, right, that Thailand increased significantly or Malaysia, I think also increasing in this type of investment also, your result will change or not? Or this kind of outward FDI will have the impact on your wage equation or not?
Okay. Let me take the second question first because it's the easiest. If I have the ability to separate out local Malaysian MNEs, all right, as well as foreign MNEs, I think the probability of observing significant MNE, non-MNE wage differentials does increase. That one of the reasons that we may find insignificant differentials between MNEs and non-MNEs is because local Malaysian MNEs were paying really high wages in the mid-1990s. That might be possible. On the other hand, in the mid-1990s in Malaysia, the amount of outward activity by Malaysian MNEs was very small. Okay. So probably that doesn't make a difference. If it were bigger, if we were to do that now, yes, it would make a difference. If we were to do that now for Thailand, yes, it would make a difference. When does it start making a difference? That's difficult to know. I think actually Thai MNEs have gone out at an earlier point in the product cycle than the Malaysians. Malaysia has a few big MNEs of its own, of course, but not that many. And Thailand, in that sense, is a bigger market. So Thai MNEs, especially the big ones, I think have bigger foreign presence, especially in food and in chemicals and so on. The science cements of the world, all the food conglomerates. These groups have substantial foreign presence in other Asian countries and in the West. I think Malaysian presence is probably maybe even smaller today as a percentage of the total of that. Now, the question about redoing it for newer years, would it be different or not? My results for 2000, 2004 say that the MNE local wage differential becomes stronger. Would be stronger in 2000, 2004 than in older years. And I have better education controls in the newer years. So it could be a function of having education variable or not. It could be a function of different timing. It also could be that the mid-1990s was rather strange in Malaysia. That we have a bunch of other studies at the industry level showing that differences between MNEs and non-MNEs in terms of like aggregate productivity. There's 1 or 2 or 3% absolute percentage points. So it's not very big. They're almost the same. And you see similar data for Thailand in '96. You go back to the '96 census. There are a lot of industries in which actually local companies are more productive than foreign. It might be something about the mid-1990s that would lead to different results. But without data, it's pure speculation to guess about that. I want newer data from Malaysia. But again, the census after 2005 has become quite different. And I'm really not comfortable with the stratified samples that I've seen. The data through 2004 are quite good. The data that we have here, or that we had here, and that we had in the I'm amazed at how weak these results are. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of what the first paper's results look like. These are when you estimate by, when you estimate, for example, this is the same share of foreign workers, and these are the different types workers. You see, males, if you're technical supervisor or managers, and you have larger shares of foreign males, actually that average wage goes up. What's that telling you? When you're hiring a foreign male as a manager or as a technician, it's a high-level guy, right? You're not hiring the cheaper one. And this is leading to a higher factory-level bill for this type of worker. You see a little bit for females in the managers here, but not in the lag. This is the share of foreign workers opposite sex. Again, the only significant effect is here. Oh, there's one over there. And then these are the share of foreign workers in other occupations. Negative effect on wages for managers. And technical supervisor for this one. So this gives you a little more of a flavor of the interactions that go on. And the results that we saw today are a way of trying to summarize them. That's very common. And then when you go down to the M&E local differentials, again, they're mainly insignificant.
Can I ask last question?
Sure.
Yeah. Your study assumes certain structure of the labor market. I wonder in Malaysia, does the institutional factor like trade union plays any role in the labor market at all? You mentioned that in Malaysia, minimum wage is illegal. But how about the other institutional factor like labor union?
Labor unions in Malaysia are very similar to in Singapore. They exist in name only. And they're controlled by the government primarily. All right, so basically they're institutions that the government uses to control and give benefits to workers. And very often what happens is you do have negotiations between unions and companies, but the government's always very heavily involved trying to get them to agree on. Strikes are, especially in the mid-90s, were essentially illegal in Malaysia. I think even today, probably more today than before, because the present Prime Minister is rather insecure. He would arrest you if you tried to lead a big strike. I think.
So other questions? Other questions from the floor? No? Okay. Eric, today we would like to thank you very much for coming to our seminar series, and hope you come back again if you have other paper. So thank you very much. And we have the token of our appreciations. Can I ask Paul? Yeah, please. Could you kindly present our appreciation to Professor Eric Ramstetter? Thank you very much all for coming for the seminar today. Thank you.